So we're at the start of day 2. I have about 100 kilometers to cover to get to Burgos. First 30 kilometers is on roads that I hope will mostly be like this, and then the last 60 or so is going to be on another Greenway, an old rail line. Seems to be decent enough surface. That of course is the one bit of a wild card. 60 kilometers on very rough gravel will be pretty hard, but let's see, hopefully that's not it. Still got a bit of apprehension and stuff about the scope of the trip, but I'm hoping that will wear off as the day progresses and I get some cycling done. It's beautiful anyway. Beautiful morning, probably about 10 degrees centigrade. It'll warm up as the day goes on. I seem to be lucky with the weather. I've kind of got out of the high risk rain belt anyway, I think now. And yeah, we'll see how things get on, and hopefully it doesn't get too hot towards the end, which is the other big risk factor. So a note on the apprehension I've mentioned there. I find that before I set off on a tour, and certainly for the first couple of days, I'm often quite apprehensive about it. I'm thinking about the things that can go wrong. I'm going, oh, will I be able to manage this? And that normally lasts for the first 5 or 10 kilometers each day, and then I get into it and it's absolutely fine. And I'm saying that because I think it's one of the things that puts people off doing it themselves. You think about the things that can go wrong, and that perhaps stops you setting out or stops you planning. And instead, I think what you have to do is think of all that as part of the adventure. You know, there's nothing without risks, and really most of the time, if something goes wrong, well, I mean, you're going to be able to sort it out one way or the other. Perhaps it's going to take longer. What's your worst case? You have to catch a flight home or something. That's part of the calculation. In the case of this Spanish trip, of course, an added feature of it is that I very little Spanish, and I knew this was going to be a challenge. And indeed, my first night in Quioncoces de Yuso, where I'm just leaving now, neither the hotel owner spoke any Spanish, nor did the people in the bar where I went to eat. Anyway, as you'll have seen, the first 7 kilometres of today's route were on back roads before I came onto the BU 550. I anticipated this being maybe a bit busier than it was. In fact, it was grand. As you can see, there's not really much traffic going in my direction. And again, this was generally my experience. I spent very little time in Spain travelling on actually busy roads. I used cycle.travel to plan routes in advance, and it proved particularly reliable in this case, and very valuable in fact, because I didn't know anything at all about Spanish roads, and was struggling even to work out for certain what was going to be a motorway and what wasn't. So having something that reliably routed me away from busy roads was handy. I particularly enjoyed that gorge bit that we're just coming through at the moment. This was a day where I knew food was going to be a bit of a challenge. The hotel I was staying in, there was only me and one other set of guests, so they weren't really open for breakfast. So my semi-breakfast had been a piece of bread and some bacon I'd taken from the meal the previous night in the bar in the town. I'd looked at the route, and there wasn't that much directly on it that looked like it might be open. It's too early. Tourism hadn't really started also early in the morning, and I didn't spot anything in the towns I was going through. So I knew as I was going onto the rail line, the long Greenway, that there'd be almost nothing whatsoever on that, at least directly on the line. So the big hope was that there would be something in the town of Trespaderne, again not sure how that's properly pronounced, that I'm just about to arrive in here. And indeed there was, fortunately, there was a single coffee shop was open. The bakery wasn't open and nothing else seemed to be, but the coffee shop actually was grand. I was managed to negotiate not only coffee and tortilla for breakfast, but also to get a second tortilla and bacon roll packed, so I'd have something for lunch on that Greenway. So I've just had a quick coffee stop in the town of Trespaderne, I think that's how it's pronounced, and we're looking for the entrance to the Greenway. I'm a little unsure of directions here, so let's go back. This next bit's a little complicated and I failed to video it, but basically here's the route on the map with some still photos I did take, and then we're rejoining as we get across the bridge and leading up to the start of the rail line. And so here we reach what is going to be the exciting part of the day. I'm going on a Greenway, the Via Verde Santander Mediterneo, which was basically a rail project to link the port of Santander with the Mediterranean at Valencia. They never quite completed it. The tunnelling through the Cantabrian Mountains, I think, was a little bit too tough. It was abandoned finally in the 60s, and I think the rail line was closed down in the 80s, but more recently they've been turning it into a long distance walking and cycling route. Now, I had been looking at it on Google Street View, but a lot of the photos that you could see normally from a road above it showed very rough surfaces, but they were quite old, and it did seem to be that people had cycled it. But it was definitely a 60-kilometre route that I wasn't really sure I was going to be able to cycle all the way through, but it was clearly worth the risk. So I'm along my first kilometres of that old rail train that runs from, well, it was to run from Santander to the Mediterranean, but they never quite finished it, and it's recently been turned section by section into a Greenway, and I think we can agree it's a pretty spectacular Greenway. At this section, it's following the Ebro Valley, which is fairly well known to Irish lefties because it's where a lot of the Irish International Brigade were killed in the Ebro offensive, I think in 38, maybe it was 37. But yeah, it's spectacular. And yes, today I did encounter rain showers. So I'm on the rail trail, 3 kilometres in. It is absolutely spectacular. The surface is, it's a reasonably rough gravel. If I get much above 15 kilometres an hour, it's a little uncomfortable and I start to slide on it. So if you're in a hurry, you possibly wouldn't take this route. But in terms of scenery, it is fairly amazing. The one thing I would say about the gravel is I don't have gravel tires on, they're really road tires. I mean, they're fairly thick wheels, so and I think they're 28mm, so if you're on a gravel bike, it'd be much more manageable. There's a guy actually zooming past me in one now. Hi! He's having great fun with it. I think people are amused by me with the touring panniers on the back of it. But yeah, great day so far. Very, very little traffic again, even on what are the main roads. That was my big kind of concern, but really once I was free of the port area, I've seen very little traffic. I did get passed by a double trailer carrying straw, but I find in general the drivers are very good. They pass you on the other side of the road. A couple of them giving me waves of beeps of encouragement if I was on a steep hill at the time. But yeah, let's go back to the trail. In fact, for most of my entire trip, I saw very few touring cyclists, except when I was on Eurovelo 3 or the Camino route. Otherwise, I was pretty much on my own, but I did see a lot of both road and gravel cyclists who weren't carrying any luggage, so clearly was staying in local hotels or whatever, and were doing day trips out. So there are quite a lot of cyclists on the road, and that means drivers are pretty aware of coming across cyclists. It's always a benefit in numbers. It's got some big tunnels. This one is 260 metres in length, but they are lit if they're long tunnels. The 76-metre one wasn't, and the lights turn on as you cycle through. I got cut off there, but yeah, the tunnels have automatic light systems that detect you cycling into them and turn on. I would recommend having lights on the bike though as well for just seeing the bit immediately in advance, in particular if like me you're wearing sunglasses and you don't want to have to keep swapping over all the time. So the track, as you can see, the surface does vary a lot. Some of it is relatively smooth gravel, and then there's sections that are really quite rough and bumpy, but on this particular Greenway I was able to maintain, I think, a speed of at least 15 all the time. I noticed an offshoot of the track and decided to investigate, and it's got rather an exciting bridge which I've just been on, but I didn't spot there was a step down to the bridge, so I stumbled, and it was a very narrow ledge. There was a guardrail, I wouldn't have fallen over, but my phone might have, and that would have made a mess of things. Anyway, yeah, if you're doing this, it's just before the third tunnel, coming from Trespaderne, which I'm not sure how to pronounce. Yeah, dropping my mobile phone into that gorge would have been possibly the greatest disaster that could have happened because all my bookings were on it. I was using it for navigation, although now that I have the Nion unit for the e-bike, at least I back up maps and navigation on that. One of my credit cards depends on having the phone with me to actually be function. Not a good idea to drop your phone into a gorge. It's surprising how dependent you are. And of course, all the still photos that I was taking were taken off that phone. All of which reminds me that I really must do a how-to video that looks specifically at mobile phones. I think it's the one thing I've never produced. I've got a pretty high-end phone. It's the iPhone 15 Pro Max, and my justification for that is that I do a lot of video and photography with it, so I really want to have the best camera that I can easily transport, and that pops in and out of my pocket. And this trip was the first big test, really, where I had replaced navigation primarily with using that phone with actually having an on-handlebar device, a Nion control unit for my bike. I did also have an in-ear earbud, which was linked to the map reading on the phone, so that would give me turn-by-turn directions from the Cycle Travel app. Did a quick hotel laundry on the t-shirt I was wearing on the ferry on the way over because I was sleeping in it. That basically means you wear it in the shower, then you throw it and trample it as you shower yourself, drain it out and then hang it up. And then the next day I hang it off the back of the bike and it should be dry by the time I get to Burgos. There's also quite a lot of landscape variation on this Greenway. The mountains initially when I'm coming to the start and that spectacular gorge, and then quite long sections where it's more sort of farmland and then dips back into mountains again. Once you're out of the mountains as well, you start to come across ruined train stations more regularly, and here I'm stopping for that omelette lunch I packed in the cafe this morning, and then back on the road again. As you'll have noticed from the footage, I'm really not running into very many cyclists or walkers on this, except right at the start in terms of the gorge where there were a few. And I suspect it would probably be different once you got into the summer properly. This is really mid-May I'm cycling this, and people obviously aren't using it in any large numbers. There is some disadvantages to that, as we'll find out later on, but for sections of it I was passing the occasional repair crew working on a section, and that was about it. My early to mid-May start was a bit risky in terms of you might get a lot of rain at that, but actually I'm far more worried about getting hit by a heat wave than I am getting rained on. Handy cycling around Ireland and Scotland a lot in terms of setting your expectations at a useful level, and I did get sunburnt. I'll show you a photograph even at the end of this through the top of my bicycle helmet, so you definitely do need to be aware of the sun even on this sort of day where it's quite grey and overcast a lot, and indeed a few times I was going to be caught in the rain. Indeed, this section here where I'm cycling south into the clouds and I can see rain happening to the left and the right of me, and then eventually I'm going to end up cycling into it, was quite thrilling just because of how far you could see those rain clouds in the distance. So the weather's mostly been grand, but every now and again there's a torrential shower. So if you can manage it, better to get into shelter. I'm in one of the old rail stations that's on the route. It's got a bit of a porch over me, so it's keeping most of the water off me. But hopefully this won't last long. I needed a break anyway. As you've probably also noticed, there's pretty much no infrastructure along the route, including no toilets. Now, it's not quite as bad as it looks because in a few places it is actually going on the outskirts of where there's a town. A fairly traditional thing, of the railway station being built on the edge of a town. So in particular, if you're somewhere where you're coming across a ruined station, the odds are that you're probably within a kilometre of a village or a small town. I don't know how many of those would have things open at this time of the year. That might well be an issue, but also there are quite long sections. Certainly you're talking 10 kilometres probably, maybe even 15 kilometres, where there really is nothing whatsoever. So you do want to be thinking about that, and as I said, in particular I was aware that in travelling in early May, when a lot of the tourist places wouldn't have opened anyway, I definitely needed to be thinking about food in advance. And if you were travelling in the summer, you would very definitely want to be thinking about water in advance and making sure you had brought enough to last the trip. Spain is quite good for public fountains, actually, particularly on the Camino routes. But again, this rail line is often quite isolated and away from everything. Of course, that's also the beauty of it. I mean, I'm basically just cycling through birdsong all the time on this route. The occasional bunch of wildflowers, not so many animals in the fields here, but in other parts of the trip you're going to hear the sound of cowbells, sheep, goats, and even signs that warn you about bears being crossing the road. Being an old rail line, this of course has the advantage of not having much gradient on it. You basically, the bit where I came on, and you're following the Ebro, it goes downhill for a long bit, and then the bit that I'm on now, it's going uphill to a pass for quite a long distance. I think there's probably about 15 kilometers of gradual incline before you get up to the top of that pass, and then you're switching to going downhill again pretty much all the way to Burgos. I would be quite inclined to return in the future and actually follow this rail line all the way from Santander down to Valencia. I would say that's very spectacular. I don't think it's navigable all the way. From reading other accounts, there are bits where you have to go off and use roads instead. But an awful lot of it is at this point, and it would make quite a trip in itself just for all the variation of sceneries and landscapes you'd find. Something for me to look into and perhaps plan for a year or two in the future. So I'm about 26 kilometers out of Burgos. I think that means I'm either at the top of the long, slow climb to the kind of badlands, or maybe I'm getting near the top. It is still climbing a bit ahead of me. From memory, I think there was 400 meters of climbing today, and I've done about 416 at this point. 74 kilometers cycled. Which I'm feeling. For all my experimentation with really stretching battery efficiency, if I have the chance, once I get to this part of the day, I'm going from eco into tour mode and not worrying so much about it. That's part of the joy of carrying a second battery. I was trying to work it out. I think I'm doing an average of about 80 kilometers a day for the 22 days I'm here, which is a little ambitious. There's a couple of days I'm going to have to look at, because there's two that are 100 kilometers plus the 2,000 meters of climbing. That's going to be pretty tough, whatever way you do it. So I'll see how my legs are when I get to those points in a few days' time, and I think at least one of them there is a shortcut I can take, so it's less for that day, but we'll see. But anyway, so here we are. It's been great today. Spectacular scenery. 60 kilometers of this Greenway, which is a lot, and the rest was really on quiet roads. And yeah, I'm enjoying it. I suspect this particular tree here must be a lot older than everything else, because look at the lichen on it. That tree lichen, at least in Ireland, is extremely slow growing. It takes many, many, many years to form. And it's not visible on most of the other trees, the taller ones there at the back, just on these two very short ones. I don't know what species they are. But yes, impressive tree lichen anyway. So I'm not intending to make my usual kind of, you could probably wild camp here suggestions on this trip. A couple of reasons. One is that they have a real problem with forests, so there are additional risks. Now, I think that probably enough rain locally, recently, that mightn't matter so much. But secondly, while in Ireland and indeed Scotland, I can tell the difference between what's farmland and what's not. Here I find it more difficult, but there are definitely spots that if I was wild camping on the trip, I would think, oh yeah, you could definitely put a tent up there. And I'm sure if you were doing dusk to dawn camping, nobody would disturb you. The Greenway has multiple spots. Both Greenways had like that. This was, in fact, my first really long trip that I was entirely based in hotels. All previous trips I've done have been almost entirely camping and mostly wild camping. And part of the reason I did it differently with this trip is hotels are far, far cheaper in Spain than they are in Ireland, or indeed Scotland, when they were frighteningly expensive. I spent an average of €50 a night. There were lots of places. It was quite easy to find places for about 40, and I wasn't really going for the most budget places either. When you're on the Camino route as well, there's also the Albuquerques, which are basically a big room full of bunks, which I think you'll get for about 12 to €15 a night. So it's certainly possible to do this very cheaply without having to actually camp. That said, after having done it, I would be quite interested in camping. There's so many beautiful spots I'm passing on this that it would be quite nice to go asleep and wake up on them. So now we are in the final approach to Burgos, and here we're seeing the problem I was referring to with not many people having used the trail, which is that wild rapeseed that has grown in the middle of the trail in sections. You can't really tell that easily from the video, but it's actually so tall that it's whacking my legs as I'm cycling through it. And it also is hitting the panniers on the bike. So not a disastrous situation, but in fact it was kind of a question of pushing through it in parts. As you get closer to Burgos itself, and we're starting to get into the Burgos region now, I did pass a few cyclists, again surprisingly few considering how good this trail actually is. And it's eventually going to be bringing us down into an industrial estate. And here we go on the edge of Burgos itself. It follows the industrial estate through for a while. You'll notice I'm on the path here. Now my cycle app was telling me that that was a cycle path. I'm not really sure if it was or it wasn't, but you're taking this through, and then that's going to bring me right into the suburbs of Burgos, where unfortunately I ran out of battery, so I don't have a video of the last couple of kilometers. There was a comedy moment where it tried to send me down those steps. The route I have posted in the video description avoids the steps, so you don't need to worry about that. Burgos itself is an absolutely stunning city. I liked the hotel I was staying in. There's that sunburn. And I did a quick visit to the cathedral the following morning, which really had far too much gold for what I like. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Make sure you follow the channel to get the future videos. Check the description for the full route map. I'm scrolling through it here at the moment. And check my Instagram for live photos that I post from my trips, also called eBike Touring Life. Stay tuned because I have 22 of these to come, and I'm going to do a few background videos on things like getting the ferry over and how all that worked, as well as putting up more content from Ireland this year.